There comes a fork in the road moment in every organization's life when decisions can't be made without answering the existential question, who are we anyhow? This week, we had two opportunities that could have made us rich at Work Wisdom, but it didn't feel quite right. We spent 3 days hemming and hawing about it, and then we ask ourselves, who are we anyhow? Organizational archetypes are powerful ways to help your organization become the most potent version of itself. Welcome to the Behaviorist with Work Wisdom, where we help you adopt high-performance mindsets, behaviors, communication, and culture. I'm your host, Kedren Crosby. Our intention for the Behaviorist podcast is to share accessible, concrete practices that you can weave into your whole life to begin a shift toward joy and meaningful achievement. We're so grateful to have Tracy Cutler, Executive Vice President from the Lancaster County Community Foundation, and Ryan Martin, co-founder and partner of the Infantree, joining us for this important discussion. Hi, guys.
Hi.
I'm
Thanks
so
for
glad you're here. Thank you
to be
so
here.
much. I've loved having conversations with both of you about archetypes for probably almost 4 years now.
That's quite true.
And so it's so much fun to sit here in the studio and talk about it. So thank you for sharing this with our listeners. So in 1985, there was an article that was released about this notion of organizational identity. And the authors, Albert and Wetton, taught us that understanding what is central, enduring, and distinctive about an organization helps the people inside the organization to make aligned decisions much more easily. If properly communicated, it also helps outsiders quickly understand who the organization really is. At Work Wisdom, we particularly love that once an organization is clear on its identity, it can feel almost like a calling or an organizational imperative that they must live up to in order to avoid the cognitive dissonance that comes when we act out of character. Just like at Work Wisdom this past week, we wanted to be true to who we really are so that we didn't creep outside of our identity. Once we thought about it, it was a no-brainer when we held up the mirror. So, Ryan, I know that the Infantree uses archetypes extensively. I didn't know quite how extensively until about 5 minutes ago. So can you share a little bit about how you first learned about it? And can you tell me a little bit about the origins?
Sure. So for me, I was familiar in concept with archetypes for a number of years. Different agencies that I worked with had used it at a very high level, meaning they only used what I know now, a very small part of what an archetype is. But actually just looking back at what an archetype is, where it kind of came from, I'm probably not near as familiar with all of the psychological pieces and parts that you would be from the psychology side of things, but how we've always used it and understood it from branding is it really speaks to some of those kind of universal truths about who and what an organization is. And we say that, looking back through time, literature, is kind of how we've understood themes within storytelling. So if I say a hero, we understand how that character is supposed to act, how they're supposed to perform. Sometimes it informs even the simple things of the language that they use, the way they would dress, all these things. And so for us, from a branding perspective, we believe that brands function very much the same way. So when I started in agency world, there was kind of the 12 key families, and I'll let you, if you want to explain any of those kind of the top level pieces of it, the different types that were utilized, but we wanted to dig deeper. And so we wanted to see where there was potential to maybe expand. There's an agency that we had always had a great deal of respect for called Chen Design Agency out of San Francisco. And saw that they were using this kind of complex, very visually engaging deck of cards that actually had 60 archetypes and really got into the nuance of the differing types of archetypes.
Well, so I'm interested in what you're saying, and I even sort of peeling back the onion a little bit more. So it originally goes back to the Greeks, and Plato believed that we had these forms, he called them, before they were called archetypes, where we were born. We didn't even have to learn about these forms. We were born knowing these stories of these types. And so really not too many people talked about it until Carl Jung in basically the 1950s, 1960s, was thinking about the archetypes. And he came up with more than 100 archetypes. And so my first interest in archetypes actually came from a book called Women Who Run with the Wolves. Does anybody remember that book?
I do. I do.
There's a certain type of woman, maybe our age,
perhaps.
yes, who remembers that book and found it to be meaningful, maybe in the 80s.
Right.
Yes. And so that book was a book of stories that were all about this one archetype, the wild woman archetype. And so that's when I first started learning about archetypes. But I've also been interested in archetypes through Carolyn Myss, and there are at least 60, but there are probably more than 100. In Carolyn Myss's work around archetypes, you can create your own archetype that is beyond the 60 in the archetype cards that you use and the hundreds that are in the Carolyn Myss archetypes. So it's neat how we all come to them. It is, I think, part of this collective unconscious. And when we start hearing about them, it just resonates so easily with everyone. So it's never exactly a sell. It's just, we recognize that. So Tracy, when did you first start knowing about archetypes or using archetypes?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, to your point, you kind of know about them.
Yeah.
But you don't realize it until someone gives you language for it, right?
Yeah.
So, women who run with the wolves.
Right.
And so, I mean, it was fun to start to think about archetypes in the context of branding. I mean, it's, when you think about it in an organizational context, it's a way, I think it's a way to kind of help your organization visualize its role in an ecosystem, whatever your ecosystem is. Like, what role do you play in that? And to bring those, when you look at even the archetype cards that you reference, Ryan, there's some really deep and detailed descriptions of what does this archetype do? What do they think about? How do they lead? And so creating those ideas of personified behaviors, I think, gives us a lot of power in visualizing the work that we're doing in the world.
Yeah.
I think too, in our world of branding, but I think in general for us as humans, we all want to know a little bit more about ourselves. And I think this is yet another tool. And so when we look at things like the quizzes that Cosmo puts out or the horoscopes that are out, we all want to have a deeper understanding or something that they can say, yeah, that is my part of my identity, or I relate to that or identify with that. Even just hearing the interest of other people talking about who you are and how they introduce you to someone, it all becomes part of that kind of identity piece that I think we're all naturally curious about, or should be naturally curious about, I think, to some extent. And with brands, as it's been brought into that language, we're being asked to understand how they relate to situations, how brands communicate. We talk about all the time that if you start communicating with too many different archetypes, you start having a multiple personality disorder. And so in that, you start confusing your audiences as to really what do you stand for and what do you connect with. So that's really, really, I think, huge for us as we started looking at, we want to find ways to provide our clients that we work with an opportunity to reveal and find something new about themselves. At the same time, we hope to learn through their process of their self-exploration through this, our own understanding of what that actually looks like in context.
I think it's really been an evolution, with things like branding, because people weren't using this tool. And so, branding started with logos, people's understanding of what that meant, right?
Yeah.
Somebody's building a logo and you've started, a logo is not a brand. And so this much deeper understanding of how do we operate in the world, right? Yeah. An individual's understanding of that, and then how do organizations wrap their mind about that? And ultimately bringing together lots of different individual archetypes and the way that we all connect to ourselves individually and bringing that together in an organization is a pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's so powerful. One of the things I want to talk a little bit about what we think is most beneficial about using archetypes. One of the things that I think is most beneficial is that all of the archetypes are presented in this non-dualistic way. They are neither good nor bad.
Right.
And they have light attributes. In my world, they have light attributes and shadow attributes. So I feel like as we think organizationally about who we really are anyhow, it's okay to adopt an archetype because it's neither good nor bad, but you just become sort of a more robust version of who that is. So I'm curious, what do you think is most beneficial about the use of archetypes? Ryan, if you had to pick one thing, I know you love
I do.
love them so much.
Well, and I think for us, some of that comes down to the process in which we use it. And if this is not the way you want me to describe it, please let me know. But, I think for us, what the archetype allows is we're always looking for new ways for our clients to communicate what's going on inside either their heads, inside the organization that we can't see day in and day out. And so for us, it's a really unique opportunity to provide them with ways for them to talk about themselves. And so watching that self-discovery and watching that, having that chance of wrestling with, these are all good things. These are not, as you mentioned, they're not like good or bad. There are strengths and challenges associated with each. And watching them kind of wrestle with that, and coming to grips with kind of, at our best, at our most ideal, what does that communicate about who we are? And oftentimes when they look at the challenges associated, that's when the aha kind of moments click, because they say, those challenges for this archetype are uniquely also our challenges as well. And so the way we operate and we do the process is very much of getting the organization, those key kind of stakeholders, those individuals that are living out the brand day in and day out, that are responsible to carry out that mission and vision and the purpose of why they exist, to have them do it as a group and wrestle with some of the language that they may be using slightly different for one another. And so we can get into that with the Community Foundation, how that's played out. But we had the unique opportunity to work, with both the staff and then bring the board into this and have there be a back and forth conversation as to what that actually means. So it's just as important as what you, by saying what you do stand for, is then saying, okay, that means then we don't necessarily need to stand for all of these things. So it's clarity and it's communication for us in that respect.
That's so great, isn't it? I love the wrestling part, that you put them together and you create that safe space for them to have a street fight with themselves.
No, exactly.
and think through, who are we really? And have the conversation. That's so beneficial on so many levels, not just around marketing or branding.
Correct. Exactly.
Tracy, do you have a favorite use of the archetypes or a favorite aspect of the archetypes?
Yeah, I think, one of my favorite aspects of it is the many archetypes. So, the kind of spectrum that, something like the card set allows you to kind of envision and explore. And then, the way that it challenges you as an individual and ultimately as an organization to refine your thinking. Because, there are the light sides and shadow sides. And, it helps bring that into pretty, clear focus about not only what maybe you are, but what you'd like to be. So I think the archetypes can give you some aspirational language or aspirational behaviors that help you live into the archetype that's really going to be the most powerful.
Yeah, and something I'm hearing in both of what you're saying is that it allows us to focus. It allows us to know who we're not. So I never really thought about it almost in a strategy screen kind of way, in that positive no kind of way, but that allows us to be more efficient, doesn't it?
Right. It's kind of the paradox of choice. There's so many, but when you choose one or two, then it does. It makes things easier.
Crystallizes. One of the other things I really think is beneficial about archetypes is something we know about human nature, is that we all have cognitive dissonance when we are acting out of character, like I said before. So once we have landed on an archetype or two, it feels almost painful. It feels almost like we're suffering when we act out of character. And I think that can be used in a constructive way organizationally, so that we have more alignment with our behavior as well as with our messaging and our branding. So that's one of my other favorite benefits of the archetypes. So, obviously at Work Wisdom, we're organizational behaviorists. We're very interested in behavior. And this podcast is called The Behaviorist. So, so as you think through the years in your organizations, can you recall if there's ever been a time that knowing your archetype has prevented your organization from maybe dodging a bullet or creeping away from your purpose on the planet?
I could speak from a personal example because we actually did this with our team for the Infantree brand. We broke up into three different categories. Three different groups of people within our departments, and we all went through the exercise. And my business partner, while we were in different groups, we were both coming back to this maverick personality. And if we looked back on where we were at the time, it was largely based around this idea that we had been placed in situations where we were being told the rules of the game. We were being kind of pushed into a bit of a corner on some of the things. And so our natural reaction was to say, as we move forward with our identity, we're going to start setting the trajectory. We're going to have our own unique flavor. You're not going to fence me in. We're going to show you. And so a little bit of our own kind of response to it started to come through. And I had kind of brought him along and convinced him that was part of where we were going to go with how we positioned the brand moving forward. And the rest of our team said, that's nice, guys, but that's not at all who we are. It's not how we operate. It's not how we function. And so what came out of that was there was some good things. They weren't necessarily wrong about that maverick positioning, or that we weren't wrong about it. But what they said, it needs focus. It needs directive. And so out of that actually became the warrior archetype, which is really focused around a lot more of the kind of valor and fearlessness, but there's a kind of a conviction and duty, and it's very much how we operate, how we think. It's fighting for a cause bigger than oneself. And so it took it from being kind of, a bit more aggressive and we'll say a little bit more chaotic, and brought some focus to it, which was really helpful. Yes, we're called the Infantree, and yes, we have a warrior archetype. That's the flavor in which we operate. But for us, the really big piece of that from a standpoint of clarity was the kind of supporting archetype that we always talk about that goes with that, and that is the translator. That's the role that we play. And so even this exercise gives us that opportunity to say, as the translator, we need to understand your organizational behavior. We need to understand how you talk, how you walk, how you operate, so that we can then turn around and communicate it on your behalf. And so our role, so we're warrior translators. And so for us, that has become their identity, and that's how we talk about it. And so what could have been a maverick-like personality to say, I want to go in this direction and I really don't care who's with me, my team helped bring me back to a place of saying, we understand where you're at today, but that's not how we've functioned for the last 10 years as an organization.
That's so good. You have psychological safety on your team. Everyone spoke up and said, dudes, that's not us.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's great. Did you have any examples of a time when your archetype sort of helped you dodge a bullet at the Community Foundation? Or avoid mission creep, maybe?
Yeah, it helps us to certainly, like we said, kind of keep our North Star.
Yeah.
And, we're an organization, like many organizations, that has kind of, from the outside, it may have a little bit of a nebulous purpose. So we don't make a product. We don't deliver a specific service, but we do think of ourselves as culture nudgers. I'll say culture nudgers. So how might we bring about people shifting a little bit of their thinking? How might we encourage behaviors that can change the way our community functions? And so, the way that our archetype really fits into this is there's a lot of challenges in our community. I mean, you could take an example like homelessness or providing housing in our community. And as a foundation, somebody could make a case that said, well, you're a foundation. You should make sure there are more houses for people. And, it's an important cause. It's an important thing. We could direct resources to that. But our board has wrestled with this and taken hold of our archetype, which is visionary citizen. And whereas we could possibly, buy lots of hammers and nails and 2x4s and build lots of houses and help people who are building lots of houses, we're able to kind of back up and say, our archetype actually isn't about the frontline work. Our archetype is this visionary idea. And so I'm just reading from the card, that says some things like, this archetype thinks in systems and can synthesize multiple data points. So in looking at that, really, probably our more important role and purpose is to do things like connect the people who are building houses with maybe government entities, with maybe homeowners or people who need to be and want to be homeowners. And how do we connect lots of people who are involved in the same project? And actually, that's the kind of role that we can play as visionary citizens. So, when you're tempted to go towards something that might, like you had said, make you a lot of money, or that might seem like it's solving exactly the problem in front of you, the archetype can give you the sense to say, wait a minute, is this our role? Is this the best and highest purpose that we can play as our organization? Is this what we're meant to do? Or do we need to kind of reconsider and kind of root ourselves in our archetype? So we've had those discussions at our board,
Yeah, I was just gonna say I had the unique opportunity of being on the board of the Community Foundation as well, and sitting there now. We were in our board retreat, and I bring my archetype cards along with me because I know it's going to have to come up at some point through the course of this, because it's a 2-day planning, and we start talking about some issues that are coming up, and I hand Tracy the activist and the advocate and the reformer as like, these are not our archetypes. We're being asked to play in these roles right now, and we can. But we've decided at some point that those are no longer our archetypes. And I can say our because I'm now part of that.
Sure.
But I also got to be part of the wrestling and the understanding of what that clarity has brought to the organization. And I think that keeps us in our lane. They're not to be constrictive and restrictive. They're to be guide rails. And I think that's the really helpful thing of saying, this is opportunity to stay the course and not provide, confusion to the audience. Because when we are thinking about it day in and day out, operationally, the task that we have to do and accomplish, it's really easy to say, okay, but we're going to go in this way for this tactic. But what does that mean? How does that communicate about how do we respond as a personality, as a brand, and what does that do to our identity?
Oh, it's so helpful. Yeah, the bullet that we dodged about this past week was a couple of people came to us and they wanted to have us weave in compliance, regulation, management, multinational corporation, lots of jargon, lots of acronyms, all of that. And then we remembered we're the shaman. We're the shaman sage crone. We've got like 5 of them now that go along with it. But none of them have anything to do with managing compliance and regulations, do they? And so it just was so clarifying for us. So it's so good. Kate Coleman talks about using values as bumpers. So these, when we have deeply held beliefs that guide our behavior and we stay within the bumpers. And I think archetypes help us stay within the bumpers.
They do. They give you the guide rails and the focus.
Yeah.
So it's really it kind of really clarifies your lane.
Yeah. So this takes it a little lower on the altitude, but have you ever used the archetypes in hiring or even culture shaping or even leadership development in your organizations? And if you have, what does that look like? What's it look like at the Infantree?
Great question. And again, my dorkiness about archetypes might come through here a little bit.
You might need a cape.
Yeah. And I will admit, I had known about archetypes in context for a long time and never saw their value, truthfully. And so when I started seeing what it did to organizations when they weren't being assigned archetypes, that's how they had been used in the past in an agency that you were assigned an archetype. And so that was how we operated, but they didn't go through the process of wrestling. And in that wrestling is where all the
magic.
Right, exactly. That's where the flavor really comes through. So all that to say, when we started, I think, really owning this as part of our process and how involved that becomes in telling brand stories and communicating on their behalf and using it to inform our language, we started saying, what other uses are there for this? And that opened another Pandora's box for us, because we started finding out that individuals have their own archetypes, but roles can also have their own archetypes. And so we actually imparted an archetype to each of the job descriptions that we have published for our people. And while artist and creator are all part of what we do as far as designers and that piece, we actually don't have that as a chief archetype. The chief archetype for the designer is actually an engineer. And you'd say, well, why? How does that connect? The creative part has to be there, absolutely. But to be able to think with that kind of process, to be able to engineer it so it can be used by others, that's what we want in our designers. They're not fine artists. They're not creators in that realm alone. They have to apply a system. And so, our designers, the archetype is an engineer. However, they will bring their own personal flavor to it. So what's unique is one of our designers happens to have a personality of an engineer in that, and it's works at a really wild and dynamic way. However, one of our other designers has the adventure as his personal archetype when he went through this process, and it is his identity to a T. So when you put an engineer and an engineer adventurer, you get some interesting dichotomy. That's part of the flavor of the organization. You can't have everybody being robotic in this. They have to have their own unique flavors. And we're not saying that one who has that engineer personality and engineer job description is the ideal. In fact, they need to be counterbalanced. And every role in our organization, I feel like we have a counterbalance. My business partner, also named Ryan, his archetype is very, very different than mine. And our roles have tended to be a little different in what we bring to it, which has made the organization function that much better.
That's so fantastic. What a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually didn't know that you did that. So it makes me want to do that in my organization too. Watch out. Yeah, I'm also really interested in how we use it in leadership development. So when you are hiring, do you tell the candidate at their interview, now this position is an engineer, this has the archetype of engineering, or do you not share your weirdness just yet, Ryan?
Well, it's a great question.
or do you ask, or do you try and understand their archetype?
Yeah,
as part
that's
of the fit?
more of my interest in that situation,
Okay.
because typically they don't know all of the ins and outs of these, and I'm not going to typically have 2 hours to walk them through the process that we tend to go through. That being said, it allows us to start evaluating, can they function in that role? I'll use the engineer again. Can they function in that role of an engineer, or are they too much of a creator artist type personality that they can't fit in within those forms and functions of the engineering side that we need? So that allows us to help clarify, but at the same point, understanding how they work, it's really, really important at the review time, because I'm not holding them accountable for their human archetype, their personality. I'm holding responsible for the role that they're achieving, but recognizing the strengths and challenges that personality type brings to the archetype helps put it in perspective for a lot of it. So it's not so much in the hiring as it is in the ongoing, because we would definitely overwhelm them as we say, all right, we need you to choose your archetype before we can begin this, the interview process. Yeah. That being said, as they become familiar with it, they understand how this actually relates. It gives them the aha moment. It gives them the awakening to oh, that makes sense. And so watching them self-identify who they are, and then say, okay, then how does that affect the role that I facilitate?
Yeah. It can be great. I mean, I can think about the implications for leadership development then, that you can very clearly think about what kind of talent you want to be developing in that person so that they can really be extraordinary in their role. Well, we use archetypes in executive coaching. So often when there's an identity lag in an evolving leader, we have them think about what was their last chapter archetype, and then their current chapter archetype. Sometimes we'll even have them think about 10 years from now, what archetype do you think you might be living into? Sometimes we even think about tying that to some strategy for their company. Absolutely. So that's been really helpful. So would you two, as leaders, say that you've discerned your own leadership archetype? Have you done that sort of exploration? And if so, are you willing to share on the air what you came up with? Tracy, where are you at with that exploration?
I mean, I'll be vulnerable here and say I'm not really sure. I'm not sure. I need to. I said earlier, it's like, this is a year of personal challenge and introspection. So I'm thinking it's a year to kind of dive in. It's a lot. It's a safer challenge to do it from an organizational perspective, I think. And it's an important challenge because there's a lot of coalescing around understanding of purpose. I think, so it's really interesting to hear you talk about pushing your team to really identify with their personal archetypes to understand how they fit into your mix. Is really,
So Ryan, I'm wondering about you. I'm also thinking you're the founder, you're the co-founder of the Infantree. And so if you're willing to share your own personal, and also then talk a little bit about whether or not you think your own personal archetype somehow weaves into the business's archetype.
So again, as we're looking at job descriptions alongside of personal archetypes, from my personal bent, and I never set out to be entrepreneurial. I come from a family of entrepreneurs, but never thought of it that way. I never thought of it, just kind of how business was handled. And so as I looked at this and went through it, the archetype that I've kind of owned, and it's one of those ones that it's hard to say humbly, but it's the innovator, from that standpoint of kind of idea generation, cross-pollination, high intellect, curiosity. That curiosity piece is willing to take risks. I always joke that if I was doing business by myself, I would have failed 3 or 4 times by now. We're probably up to 5 actually at this time, this long. My business partner would have never left his living room. And so he is super structured, and our appreciation for each other in this, he's also actually another one of those engineer, is his actual personality types as well, that happens to live into that role. But the two of us together, I could think the big dreams, and then he could say, and this is how we're going to make it happen. And so from that, it has really solidified our working relationship. It's very much kind of how we operate together. I think of where we're going to go, kind of almost a little bit of the vision piece of it, and then he says, all right, and here's how we're going to make it happen. And so that has become a really great balance for the two of us. So innovators become really my personal, asking the why, but as my role has shifted, I've taken on, so I'm now an innovator matchmaker, which sounds like I should be on Fiddler on the Roof, but it's really connected to not just networking, but finding those relational keys. My role has shifted to not just being vision, but also building the team. And for me, that's the part that now actually gives me goosebumps. It's putting together the right people in the spaces to live out their roles, to live out their own archetypes to some extent in this. And so I get to vision, but I also get to do it with a team. And so that visionary matchmaker is kind of how those things work together for me. We like having a kind of primary and secondary or personality and description because it provides some of that unique flavor. I like it when we can just boil it down to one. I'm just not... I don't know that I'm able to oftentimes because I like to have a compare and contrast, a push-pull.
And when you look at the challenges or the shadow side of the innovator, has it resonated with you, and has it maybe even been constructive for you in that you've been able to change behavior knowing that that's a shadow for you?
Absolutely.
Oh, how wonderful. That's good.
The challenges, and I'm just reading them quickly, but the challenges: difficulty staying focused. Yep. All ideas and no action. Could be. Danger of getting lost in the mind. And these are absolutely things that I tend to, knowing that and letting my team know that that's the case, and recognizing I need to put checks and balances in my own life to make sure that that's not the case. So those things are actually the exact opposite of what my business partner struggles with. So in that, there's such a great harmony to that. And we do the same thing with roles. We're trying to figure out, when we have 2 or 3 people in a role, we don't want 2 people that have the exact same personality in the exact same role. We want to have maybe a bit more theoretical individual, and it's something that is also in a role next to somebody who's a bit more of, this is how it has to be done each and every time, because they grind off the rough edges, and I think that really helps make it not just about this is the role. And we're a small organization of 13 people, so I don't know what that looks like at a 600 or 700 person organization, but for us as a small team, it's really helpful to know those pieces. The challenges are just as important as the strengths.
I'm also interested in how we evolve as individuals, how we transition as organizations. Organizational identity is very much rooted in this. They call it the CED, the central, enduring, and distinctive qualities of an organization. So the central, enduring, and distinctive qualities are supposed to be just that, enduring, not really changing. Do you think that archetypes can change? Do you think that it's a good thing that they change? Have you seen them change? So just your opinions, your thoughts, your experiences on that.
I think it's a really interesting question. And this idea of enduring archetypes for an organization, smaller organizations, larger organization, I principally like to think that there are some components that remain core to the brand. And I think simultaneously, when you have leadership changes, when you have priority changes, when you have strategic changes, I know you've had a conversation recently with Mike McKenna about leadership changes, and I think about, what does it mean for the organization that he is leading? Would that actually change the organizational archetype? I'm not sure. I think, the idea of having kind of some guardians of the culture or guardians of the organizational archetype embedded within an organization, may help smooth some of those transition and provide that consistency of purpose. And so, using, again, the archetypes, and maybe they shift. You just described, Ryan, your own personal archetype is shifting. And as individuals, our archetypes are shifting.
Absolutely.
And there are a lot of similar traits to many of the archetypes. So there's the families of archetypes, right? I mean, you rattle off several that Work Wisdom has. Yeah, Sage and Crone and Shaman.
I know.
Crone, that's kind of a rough one.
None of them are good looking. Yeah.
But you want to be around them.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't really need to get all the Botox. Crone is really my thing.
There's something, if I may, Kedren, from the standpoint, we've walked alongside of Community Foundation for the last 10 years. And I think the archetype, from what we understood that organization to be in 2009 when we first started working, to what they have become now, they radically shifted that. What's interesting, though, is some of those core things of what they've done, so the how they go about doing them, I would say, has shifted. The core purpose of a foundation hasn't changed. So there's some organizational truths. Like, if they were no longer seen as being good stewards of the resources that have been given to them, they wouldn't be a good citizen. As part of a visionary citizen, that's part of the role. Yeah. But they previously lived that out in a bit more of a rank and file, a bit more of what we would say is the sovereign archetype, from that, like, this is the tradition, and it has existed for 100 years, and that's the way we do things. But a regime change, a new influx of leadership, a new vision that gets crafted for where we can go. Some of the core of why they exist isn't going to shift, but how they go about living out that purpose, I think, does. And I think that's where, for this, having the opportunity to talk about this with Tracy here and seeing that being lived out, they do that each and every day now. They're continuing to live out the vision that was set years ago, but the archetype helps them to live into it. It just gives them some of that. And it keeps them focused, because there's a lot of other things, because of their visionary nature, that they could pick up and take on the mantle of and have 6, 7, 8 archetypes. The challenge becomes then, what are they known for? How are they understood? And keeping that clarity is sometimes the hardest part of it. It's not just what you say yes to, it's what you say no to in that. And as a brand, as being that container for meaning, what is that meaning going to stay true to?
And that shared language, the value of shared language within an organization, I think really goes to, the idea of purpose and that continuity. And, when you have organizations where there's shifts in personnel and individuals and so having that to lean into and to give you roots is a really powerful tool to move organizations forward.
Yeah.
It motivates you.
Yeah. Yeah, we think quite a lot about aspired culture, so we will go into an organization and assess their current culture. And then if they're doing some strategic planning and they want to shift their culture to a new culture, they really paint the picture of what that new culture looks like. So I've been toying with this idea of, can one have an aspired archetype to which one is crafting behaviors that will lead it in that direction. But I need to probably write an article about it before I talk on the air about it, because I would never do that. Talk about an idea before it's fully fleshed out. No, definitely not me. So let's think about our listeners. What advice do you have for our listeners regarding concrete use of archetypes? Well, which should they do first, or what's the one thing you would recommend to them? Tracy, do you have something in mind?
I think to begin, becoming familiar with the archetypes. I think that one of the opportunities that this exercise presents is just the idea to kind of expand our understanding and our mind around, what is this? Because as you go through, you'll find, I know all of these, but they're not coming, here's one sitting here, the hedonist. I mean, that's one.
Sure.
We know him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So,
I think I work with him, actually.
Right,
He's
right.
a client.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that simple idea of, going back to a kind of sense of self, I think being in touch with that gives us a lot of opportunity to springboard into our work that we're doing in any organization, any interactions that we're having. So
yeah. And it's so neat because there's so many different approaches to archetypes. So depending on who you are, you can buy the book that most fits you. If you're crony, sagey, shaman-like, you should buy the archetype cards from Carolyn Mess. If you're interested in gorgeous beauty, I think that the Chen archetype cards would really be a great start for you. So do you have any concrete wisdom for our listeners?
This is so not concrete. That's what's so great about it. But from the standpoint though, of I think you can use them for a lot of different reasons and a lot of different whys. In this, I think that archetypes, themselves, they're tools. It's really tools in the hands of how you want to use them. The craftsman, maybe, that you truly get that the artistry to come through. So I think oftentimes we get very self-focused on these things and we can go about them for ourselves. What I think is really helpful, and maybe something that concrete that we think, don't do it by yourself. Do it with, I've done this with my wife. That's an interesting one. As you start communicating, okay, I'm seeing this. Do you agree? Yeah, you're this way, but you forgot about this list of challenges that also is part of your personality type. Okay, I got to keep looking, and so in that we don't go through this world by ourselves, and we can't live into our archetypes only in our own heads. It has to be something that we have to do in community, and I think that is helpful. I think the way we've seen it work with organizations, organizational culture, and using archetypes to help them talk, the final archetype is great, and it really does provide us with a lot of value. But the process of getting there, in my opinion, is more important.
I'll echo that. I mean, just using the tools to spend time with your team and work through that process together is, even if it's just an archetype game. I mean, depending on how you decide to really integrate it into your strategy, but having that shared language and that understanding and challenging each other, the wrestling that you described is really powerful for a team.
Don't let the name itself. I will say this for every one of the cards you mentioned about the crone.
Oh, gosh,
don't let the name itself be what takes it out of the equation for you. Because we had a retirement community do this. The individuals who were running the retirement community, the board and the executive staff, took through this process, and the one they came out with was child. And I would have never put it into the mix for them. I would have never thought, but the way they communicated is this sense of wonder and opportunity that they have at this stage of life that they haven't had since they were a child. It's rediscovering that. And I thought, wow, I can write some language hearing that from them after hearing that, but it was never one I would put in the mix. And unfortunately, like we associate too much meaning with words that we can't back up with that same meaning. And so I think we all use words assuming we understand what they mean. And if we are able to dig a little deeper and find that common language, and say, okay, that's really what this means, and we're all agreeing that that's what this means, then it can be, I think, transformative.
This is such good advice. Thank you so much.
Thanks for
I know our
having us.
listeners are going to love this. I'm so grateful to both of you for being part of this movement of helping world changers in the workplace enhance their individual and collective team performance. So thank you, listeners, for downloading The Behaviorist, and we hope you'll subscribe. Please reach out to us through our website, workwisdomllc.com, where you can enjoy Work Wisdom Press, Work Wisdom Productions. You can ask questions and make suggestions of topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes. As is our custom, we'll leave you with a 1-minute wisdom by Anthony DeMello. We think this rather beautifully shows the relationship between organizational identity and archetype. The sun and its light, the ocean and the wave, the singer and his song, not one, not two.